This episode, I'm joined by an anonymous guest to discuss their book, Notes on Nothing, The Joy of Being Nobody. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all this work possible, and if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, please find links for the Patreon in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, I am joined for the first time ever on Hermitix podcast. I am joined by Anonymous. So I guess say hello, anonymous person.
Hello. Great to be here. The mysterious voice of the anonymous writer is here, yes.
Exactly. We are going to be discussing your, whoever that is, your book, Notes on Nothing, The Joy of Being Nobody, which is published by As Is Press, which is their first release. They were kind enough to send me a copy, so a big thank you to As Is Press. This is a book about nothing, as is said on the in-sleeve, but more specifically, it is about a relatively brief experience in your own life when you lost yourself, when you became nobody. And to put this book in any tradition, to put this writing in any tradition, it is, let's say, an experience of Advaita Vedanta or non-duality. It is that when someone loses their ego, their self, and it is also filled with poetry. It's very joyous. It's very fun. It's very personable. It's a personable, impersonal book. But it's about losing the self. So, to the extent that you can, tell us a little bit about yourself and the origin of this book.
Well, maybe a good place to start. Is to speak a little bit. Let me rephrase what this book is a little bit, and then speak about the decision to publish it anonymously, because I feel like that will flow us into speaking a little bit about my story and myself in a kind of natural way. So yeah, I mean, you're right, and this really is a book that is, I see it really as a kind of piece of descriptive writing, almost as just reportage, really. That it's a book that tries to the best of my ability to describe and evoke a period of time where, yes, my sense of being a separate individual, quite surprisingly, unexpectedly, seemingly went away, seemingly dissolved. And I think also another thing to say about the book is even the object of the book is trying, I think, in some way to speak of its content. So I'm glad you found it joyful. I'm very glad about that, even down to the kind of, the yellow of the cover. That was a very conscious decision. And I think part of that is because I felt that the book needed to be friendly, that it needed to be personable, as you say, because I think I've come to see it as a kind of a spell. I think I've come to see it as a kind of a invocation that kind of wants to make its reader, it wants to evoke in the reader what it's trying to speak about. It wants to make the reader disappear a little bit, or at least to make their sense of being separate a little less convincing for a while. And so it felt very important for it to feel friendly and approachable. And I also think you're right that if there's any reason for it, it's to take a personal approach, if you like, an intimate approach to the impersonal. So bearing in mind that that's what the book is, I think what I would say about myself is, there were a couple of things behind the decision to publish it anonymously and to present myself as this, slightly potentially intimidating, anonymous kind of label. The first was really, I guess the first was just a poetic choice. It was just an aesthetic choice, if you like. It felt just apt. It felt right that a book about no one and nothing should be written by no one. That a book about really not just the dissolving of, and we'll get to this, I'm sure, but it's not just the dissolving or the seeming dissolving of the sense of a separate individual, but the realization, if you like, or the understanding that there never was a separate individual, that there never really is a separate individual. that a book about that, so to speak, shouldn't be written by someone. It should, it shouldn't have an identity, let's say, attached to it. So that was a kind of poetic, just a kind of aesthetic choice. But I guess bigger than that, and this is my big caveat when talking about who I am and what my story is. The first thing to say is it seems very important to me to communicate that there's no desire here in any way to be seen as as an authority or an expert or a teacher or, God forbid, a scholar on this what we're trying to speak about. That to me feels, it doesn't even feel possible. How can one be an expert on what is everything? So there's a very strong sense of wanting to avoid this story feeling special or feeling important. And I think part of what that is, a big part of that, what that is that, and I'm sure we'll get deeper into this, but I think that the sense of being a separate person, let's say the ego, I think the whole structure, if you like, or dynamic of the ego or of separation is to turn everything into an object, to turn everything into either a kind of mental interior object, a concept, an idea to be understood or gotten, or some kind of exterior goal or object, an achievement or an attainment or an experience. And so I'm very aware, and there's no judgment there. I'm not judging this. This is just what literally comes naturally to the sense of a separate individual. It's just what happens. And so what I want to do is avoid, I feel great caution around somebody sort of hearing or reading this account. And because of just what naturally comes, what happens habitually with the sense of separation, think, oh, well, this guy did this or had these conditions in his life or made these choices. So if I replicate those conditions or make those choices, I'll get this too. I think that's a very natural thing for the sense of separation to think. And what I really want to do, what I think the book tries to do over and over, and what I want to do is to precisely point away from that entire framework. I want to point away from the idea that what we're about to try to speak about, is a goal. It's not a goal. It's not an object. It's not a concept. It's not a thing that someone can get. It is, if you like, the kind of grounds of existence of those things. But it cannot be gotten by a person. It cannot be conceptualized by a person, let's say. So that's what I'm trying to point towards, probably impossibly. And so I really want to avoid the sense of my story becoming something that someone might invest in, So that's the first thing. that's the giant caveat, if you like, that I feel like it can kind of hover above this conversation. But if I was to say something about myself, maybe I would say that I'm a person who, maybe what's helpful to say is that I'm not a person who has ever seen myself as a spiritual seeker, so to speak. That I don't come from any particular tradition. I don't see this book as speaking from a particular tradition or on behalf of a particular tradition. It's true that in my family, so first biographical detail, my father is Indian. My mother is the daughter of a Polish Catholic and a Russian Jew. So I grew up this very confused individual in London. But it's true to say that my father's family has some heritage with Advaita Vedanta, which perhaps we'll talk a little bit more about. And he was not at all a devotee, or didn't he in fact was a kind of pretty radical Marxist atheist when I was growing up. I'm not sure he would call himself that now. But I didn't grow up with that tradition alive in my immediate family, but it's certainly the knowledge of it was there. And many members of his family were devotees of the Ramakrishna mission, which is an Advaita kind of school or group in Bengal, where they're from. So there was a heritage there, but it wasn't one that I connected to for many years. But I kind of came back round to it, I suppose you would say. Although the awareness of it became deeper as I got older. The next thing maybe worth mentioning is, let me see. I feel like I could say that what happened was about 10 years ago or so, I suppose you could say I had a sort of what I think of as an extremely ordinary crisis, which was, you could call the crisis of kind of success or something like that, which is to say, for like, from the time, from my sort of early 20s onwards, for 10 or so years, my whole focus was on establishing myself in my chosen field, which is writing, which is really creating things. And I think there was that long period, which is not unusual, of struggle, of trying to do that. I had early success, and then I had to sort of keep it going and replicate it. And there was a long period of feeling like I hadn't reached these goals that I had. And feeling that once I got those goals, once those benchmarks started happening, I would be able to rest, I would be able to feel complete in some way, or I would be happy in some way. And of course, what happened, and this is not at all unusual or specific to me. I mean, I think this is a very common experience for people who get to this kind of place. What happened is, by the time I was, I guess, in my late 30s, I had achieved or started to achieve a lot of those benchmarks and a lot of those goals. And I looked around myself and, inevitably thought, well, okay, all this stuff's happening. Why aren't I feeling the peace? Why aren't I feeling happy? Why aren't I feeling satisfied? And that precipitated some kind of a real reckoning, I think, where I made that classic move of thinking, well, what is meaningful? What is it to achieve this sense of peace that I seem to want to achieve, or sense of completeness, or whatever we want to call it, happiness that doesn't just last for 5 minutes and then the goalposts move, right? So that happened. And it was around that time, or in that time, that I started doing what I suppose you would call kind of self-improvement, trying to understand myself, trying to understand the patterns. That's the tack that I took. Why is it that these patterns of suffering seem to come up no matter what happens? And that took me into kind of therapy, into various kind of therapeutic modalities. It took me into also psychedelic work for a little while, very big and transformative and well-guided, thankfully, work. But what happened during that time is that I think I reconnected with this kind of message that was always there in the background, which I guess you would call the message of Advaita, or the way of understanding reality that we find in so-called non-dualist. I want to say philosophies, but many Advaita devotees, for example, wouldn't even call it a philosophy. They would call it a kind of direct understanding. But in any case, I think there was a connection. And once I kind of heard that message again, or that formulation again, there was immediately this sense of, I would say, recognition and relief, because I felt like, oh, this is all I'm hearing here is the formalization, if you like, of what is being shown to me these last years of doing this kind of inner work. That it felt to me there was a great sense of relief that I was not only hearing this understanding kind of mirrored back to me, but it was something that people have spoken about for thousands of years. That this was something that was very well articulated and had been for millennia. So that felt very meaningful. Then what I would say is that basically was the case for 10 years or something. That was the case. There was maybe a deepening. There was a deepening of this sense of recognition. There was maybe a deepening of understanding that came from my curiosity about these traditions. I never saw myself as really a devotee or a follower or a practitioner, so-called, of any of these traditions. But that remained the case. And then suddenly, whenever it was 2 years ago, there was this period of time where completely unexpectedly, I think of it as causelessly, there was just a seeming dropping away or dissolving of this sense of being separate.
Had you just out of interest, thinking back, it's very common that people will grind and have a long, arduous, or somewhat explicit and active journey, and it's the moment or a little short while after they sort of give up or internally submit or just lay down the tools that is when it comes about. Or is this purely there is no correlation or anything?
I think for me, one of the things that I can definitely share is that there wasn't this, I never felt this long, arduous, desperate search for this. And I know that many people have that kind of journey. And then, as you say, give it up, or it reaches some kind of breaking point, or there's some kind of crack that opens. That wasn't the case for me. And I can speculate why, for various reasons. Who knows? But for me, it felt like it was just a sudden, causeless happening or non-happening, as the case may be. And look, part of that may be that what was very, very clear during that period of time, when there really wasn't much me around, what became very, very clear was speaking of causality at all is very unconvincing. That it's very difficult to speak of causality because it's very difficult to speak ultimately of time. That there really is that really what is here is timeless and spaceless, appearing to a separate person as time and space, let's say. And so it really becomes difficult to speak in a convincing way that this caused this. The word that I keep coming back to, and perhaps you could teach me more about this than I know, but it's grace. The word grace, the Christian word grace, seems to resonate with me. That there's just this sudden, unbidden gift that isn't really a gift. I mean, it's not even really a gift. It's just a seeing of the very ordinary nature of what's happening right now. So that's what I can say about that. And maybe it is interesting to say that I have, this links with my intuition. I have a strong feeling. I'm convinced that there are people walking around on this planet who really have no sense of being separate, really have no sense of kind of being a separate individual, who have never said a word about this, and who have probably never practiced anything for a second, who have never meditated, let's say, or have no knowledge perhaps of these traditions. I think that's perfectly possible. I think that's probably true. And that fascinates me. And it may be that the stories that we hear about are the stories of people who have gone on this journey or have become, devotees of a particular tradition, or, people whose personality might lend itself to communication. But I think that there is something here that is happening or not happening constantly, but we just don't know about it. So maybe that's an answer to your question. Okay. The best I can do right now.
Was a very good answer. I've jotted down grace, which I think we can maybe get to later.
Yeah.
Because I just want to start so perhaps, it's difficult because you haven't explicitly said exactly what happened, other than you lost your
yeah. Well,
so maybe we could just have a brief the reason why we are talking. What exactly happened, if you can grind it down?
Well, first of all, we're confronted, and I'm sure we'll speak more of this, with the impossibility really of speaking about this. That what we're really speaking about, I think, is unspeakable, but we can try and gesture towards it. We can point towards it. So what I would say is what happened. I mean, to make it granular, I stepped outside into my garden. I'm lucky enough to have this garden that my wife sort of nurtured into life. And I walked up the little hill and sat at the top of the garden. I felt um, there was a certain sense of not being able to concentrate on work or on anything that morning. Perhaps to go back a little further, it was true that I had this interesting session or ceremony with a friend of mine, which was a kind of a healing ceremony, which was, no substances involved. It was just a kind of classic traditional shamanic ceremony. My friend is a very skilled and well trained practitioner in that stuff. And we did a little ceremony the night before, which was around inheritance. It was around ancestral healing, you might call it. So there was this kind of, I suppose, some dealings with what we might call the non-rational the night before. I woke up feeling good, feeling rested. I felt very heavy and it was a very draining, actually, this experience of this ceremony. But I woke up feeling good, but I couldn't concentrate on work. So I went out into my garden and I walked up to the top of the hill and I sat down. And what happened quite spontaneously was just the feeling of my selfhood, maybe we can say, kind of dissolving, kind of becoming one with the space around me. There was a very, very, and this remained the case for this 2 weeks that we're speaking about. There was a very deep stillness that came into my nervous system. I think that now I feel my intuition says that we carry a kind of default tension around with us all the time, body, which is really just the tension of feeling like someone, feeling like an individual. That tension seemingly went away. And there was just a seeing and understanding that all there is this boundlessness, this timeless, spaceless, we can say oneness, but it's oneness without two. So a kind of inconceivable oneness or boundlessness or formlessness. The reason I say nothing in the book, I use this term nothing, it's not nothing as opposed to something, but nothing as in no thing separate. It was seen that there's just no thing separate. And there never was anything separate. I mean, this, in a sense, is the revelation, if you like, that when the sense of being a separate individual seemingly goes away or dissolves, it's seen very clearly that it was never there to begin with, that it was only always boundlessness, just arising as that separate individual and arising as the experience of a person. So that seeing came in to my body, let's say, and it really remained for this period of time, for 2 weeks or so. What I would say is probably what was happening was a kind of vacillation. There was probably a little bit of separation or that feeling, that energy, whatever we want to call it, that contraction of feeling like a separate individual. It was probably there were remnants of it coming and going. And we'll speak perhaps more about the effects of that. So there was a kind of wrestling that was sometimes happening with what was seemingly going on. But the abiding feeling for that time was that really nothing needed to be one way or another. There was no necessity for something to be one way or another. And really what this takes us to, I mean, the way I would describe this now, and this is perhaps this would be my way into speaking about non-duality, let's say, as a whole. The way I would describe it is this. There is life, there is this boundlessness, this thisness that has been given many names. And somehow what happens, what arises in that boundlessness, kind of unthinkably, unknowably, what arises entangled with an apparent body, which is only emptiness appearing as a body, what arises is a sense of let's call it claiming, that this sense of a separate person arises in nothingness, in life, in boundlessness, and claims life. Says, this is my life, and I have to deal with it. I have to figure it out. I have to make the right decisions. This is important. I have to do this the right way, or feel bad about failing to do that. And that energy, that claiming energy, that is what went away for this period of time. So I guess in the traditions, you can see it in Advaita and Zen and so on. There's some talk of doership, that it's the possibility that doership can end. And I think that's what I'm really trying to point towards. That it wasn't that during this period of time, it wasn't that perceptions vanished or something, or that the world vanished, or that seeming experience went away. It was that everything could unfold in the way that it has always unfolded, that this person could live out its life in the way in many ways in the way it's always lived out its life, but that what was not there was a sense of claiming, a sense of some individual claiming that life as its own. And so it was just seen that all there is boundlessness, seeming to be whatever, right? So speaking to someone happened, but it was just life speaking to someone, you might say. Yeah. Sitting and working at the computer happened, but it was just life sitting and working at the computer, And that was really the best. That's the best I can do to speak about the fundamental experience. I call it a non-experience because really what it amounted to was the end of the sense of a separate person who could experience something. So in a way, it was the end of experience. It was just the seeing that life, there is just lifing, if you like. There was just nothing, everything, right? So that was really perhaps the fundamental understanding of that time. And then what happened seemingly after a couple of weeks was the sense of the separate person came back, or it seemed to return. And there was, again, someone claiming this life. Now, where I am now, so to speak, whether that seems as convincing as it once did, that's an interesting question. It doesn't. and there's also, an unavoidable knowing now that even this person feeling itself to be separate is boundlessness arising as that. So there's a kind of simultaneity.
Is that painful to have that?
No, it's beautiful.
Well, I mean, to read that, to have the knowledge.
Yes. Well, it's a good question. It can be painful in that there's an extra layer added where it's like, oh man, why am I feeling this reactivity? Why am I suffering in this way? When I know intellectually that all this is boundlessness appearing as that. Yes. But deeper than that, though, somehow unspeakably, and we'll talk about this unspeakableness, because more and more I gravitate towards not saying anything about this, because it's impossible to just speak about, which is this kind of simultaneous knowing that even the person feeling frustrated that they have lost this is this appearing as that.
Yeah.
And that is paradoxical and unspeakable, ultimately. And I think when we're speaking of this, when we're speaking of non-duality, let's say, we are speaking of paradox, very deep paradox, really. And it's a paradox that's right there. I think about it often. It's right there in the Heart Sutra, one of the foundational texts of Buddhism, venerated by most schools of Buddhism. I think it's the second verse. emptiness is only form, form is only emptiness. I mean, that right there, to me, if you really grapple with those words, that is the completely inexpressible paradox of this.
Yeah.
That we're not speaking about a kind of nothing or emptiness that is somehow beyond this world of form. It's not beyond, it's not behind, it's not above. It is the world of form somehow. So I think what I'm left with is that kind of unspeakable paradox. And so yeah, the inclination in the time since I wrote this book is really just not to say anything about it. I don't speak about this in my regular life at all. It doesn't, there seems no necessity to. Yeah. What happens is when people ask me about it, or when someone like you invite me on their wonderful podcast, there's a kind of enthusiasm. There is an interest that comes up to speak about it. But in general, I wouldn't say that's there. In general, I would say there's a tendency towards silence, really.
Yeah. I mean, this notion of paradox is the super fascinating one, because it sort of folds all of Advaita Vedanta into the equivalent of a Zen koan, right? It's something, if we were to use the metaphor of light or the sun as that, the isness, then the clouds that are supposedly in front of the sun are the sun. So, this whole idea of you are in, what was Alan Watts' biography, In My Own Way, which is a fantastic title. It's the double play of words, is that you're in your own way, but knowing that you're in your own way is the same isness that you are trying to get out of the way of. And so what is to be done other than nothing?
Yes.
Because what you are doing and what is, and what you are to do also is. And so you just get caught. Relax, maybe. But, what does that mean?
Well, yes. What you say is precisely right, first of all. And I think the Zen koan kind of example is great, because I think very often it's really the first Zen koan. I have a very good friend and a kind of elder in my life who's a very serious Zen practitioner. And so I've been lucky enough for him to have introduced me to some elements of the Zen tradition. And one of the first, I think it is the first koan that you have to study if you're studying Zen. This is a paraphrase, but it's the famous, that the student asks the master, does a dog have Buddha nature? And the master answers, mu, M-U. And one of my favorite, and this term mu kind of recurs through the koans and through Zen. And one of my favorite definitions of it is, I think it's actually Robert Pirsig. It's like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. He calls it, mu is the unasking of the question. And in a way, that's what we're really gesturing at here. It's the unasking of the whole question of what is there to do. What is there for someone to do? Well, what is this one who wants to do something? So, yes, really what's being gestured at is that there's no prescription here. That there's nothing that a person can do to attain this, because this is already everything. The Sufis have this beautiful formulation, which is, this is the ultimate secret because its answer is everything. It is hidden everywhere. So yes, for the person, it is a bind. For the person, it's a kind of a loop. I mean, in some ways, the person can never touch this. The sense of the individual can never touch this, because its very nature is to see itself as separate, and because its very nature is already it. So how can the eye see itself? I mean, that's the sort of impossibility that we get to. So yes, I mean, in the end, we're left with silence. There's nothing to be said. Yeah. But at the same time, because we are dancing in this paradox, because formlessness is emptiness and emptiness is form, there is no, well, let's put it this way. To stay on Zen, there's quite a well-known quote by a Zen master. I don't have his name, but the quote is fairly well known, which is to speak of this is to tell a lie, but to remain silent is a kind of cowardice. Which seems very interesting to me. I mean, cowardice seems like a strong word, but I think what he's pointing towards is, since all we have is language, since form is formlessness, maybe since there is only this paradox, maybe why not? I don't have the frame. So, for example, if you read, when I read Meister Eckhart, I was reading a Meister Eckhart sermon the other day. And for me, Meister Eckhart, I mean, Christian mysticism, we find this message. I mean, he's speaking of the same thing. But he has a kind of Christian frame. So I remember reading a passage where he says, well, chattering too much about God is a sin, is to sin against God. But I don't have that frame. That frame doesn't sort of sit in me. So I don't see how you can sin against this. It's exactly what you said. Speaking of this or not speaking of this is equally this arising as that.
Yeah.
So as we are in that paradox, why not? That's what I'm left with,
Yeah. I mean, it's intriguing. Ramana Maharshi, he has this idea that when you become a seeker, this moment of like, okay, that real moment of, oh, okay, I'm a seeker now, whatever that intuitive felt sense is. He says your head is in the tiger's mouth. And I think I'm right in understanding that his symbol for this is that when the tiger's mouth bites down and rips off your head, your ego is gone. And it's interesting that, I know I might be wrong in that, who knows, but it's all isness anyway. So, but one of his sort of followers, or let's say like later disciples, did not direct follow, Ramesh Balsekar, says the problem is that in trying to wrestle with what to do with your head being in the tiger's mouth, you bolster the self-same ego, which is the problem. And so he has this great kind of double paradoxical twist where he says, just accept the ego, because the ego as the isness has to be accepted. So just accept it. And then you can sort of almost triple paradoxically step back and see that, oh, there's the ego, it's doing its thing. Whatever this, that's nothinging. Yes. And you just accept it. But either way, we are, as you said, caught in the bind. I mean, to talk or not to talk. I mean, both is the silence is still a phenomenal isness in a way, or phenomenality of the isness.
Yes.
But yeah, cowardice is pretty strong.
Cowardice.
I don't think is.
Well, I think what was.
Sorry, isn't that a sort of a cowardice would be a personalization of it, where you didn't have any choice either way. So.
Yes. Well, I mean, what we have to remember is he's speaking as a Zen master from a teaching tradition. So he's speaking from a tradition that believes that teaching is necessary. So there is a way of seeing this, which I don't know if I see it this way, but there's a way of seeing this where it's once one has understood, let's say, the nature of reality, there is somehow some responsibility to share that message. So I think perhaps that's the context of this. And look, I mean, this brings us into the whole question of practice and whether it is possible to practice towards an achievement of this. And ultimately, I feel like what we're speaking there is something like applied non-duality or something, which is just ridiculous. It just doesn't compute for me. And we can speak about where that might have come from. I mean, it's kind of interesting to me. I mean, sometimes I've thought, I'm sure others have had the similar thought, but sometimes I've wondered whether, before I get there, I should also circle back on Ramana Maharshi. Yes, he said, it's like having your head in the tiger's mouth. He also said that silence is the highest teaching, and he would often sit for hours just in silence with his students. And by the way, that there is something perhaps that seemingly can be communicated non-verbally, seemingly just in presence, in some kind of physical presence. But in any case, to go back to practice, sometimes I've wondered, and this is it, for many people who have dedicated their lives to practice, I'm sure this is a confronting idea. So let's just call it just a kind of idle speculation. But sometimes I've wondered whether these traditions that emphasize, years of practice and the purification of the mind and the body and so on, it seems to me possible that they began perhaps with someone or a group of people even who had this non-experience of the dissolving, let's say, or the seeming dissolving of the sense of separation. And in that experience or non-experience, they observed certain things. Maybe they observed this stillness in the nervous system. Maybe they observed a kind of stilling of the thoughts, or a kind of sparseness of thought, because who in that non-experience, what individual could those thoughts arise on behalf of? So it's quite natural for thoughts to kind of thin out. I mean, that's certainly something that seemed to happen during this period of time that I've tried to write about and tried to speak about. Maybe they noticed a kind of wonder at everything, at every small moment, that in those moments was this quiet kind of wonder because all those moments were windows into what is. They were just seen as what is arising as everything. So maybe these observations were made, and then there was an attempt to, like the one we're speaking now, there was an attempt to share those observations. But of course, they were being shared with people who felt themselves to be separate people. And so the observation, in a way, could it be possible that what happened is, let's say, the effect was mistaken for the cause? And so these observations become practices. Oh, let's still the mind. Let's still the body. Let's practice, mindful wonder in every small moment. And so they become, through the lens, if you like, of the separate individual, a practice that will lead to this, when this was only ever understood causelessly, as it were. That's a possibly sort of blasphemous thought if you've dedicated yourself to these traditions. That has come up for me. But yes, so yeah, let me leave it there. Let me leave that there.
Absolutely. But there is a key point there about, because you used the word dancing earlier, and the subtitle of your book, which I think should have more emphasis, is generally in our discussion, is the joy of being nobody. So this notion of people finding, or people, let's just use the terms, people having this experience, this non-experience, and then desiring to share it. It does bring about this question of, well, if I have a meal, if the meal is dreadful, I don't want to share it. So in that notion of wanting to share it, or of just general sharing, like a dance, there is something that seems to gesture towards a bliss, a joy, again, a dancing, that one wishes to share. You don't wish to share bad things. You don't wish to share that which is going to harm people. But this is beyond, in the sense, or beyond whatever word you want to use, in the sense that it's not phenomenal. What can this bliss, this peace be?
Yes. Yeah, you're pointing towards something that feels very true and very important, which is, and of course, the descriptor used in Advaita, very old descriptor for what we're speaking of, is Satchitananda. That is the Sanskrit term meaning being, consciousness, bliss. But it's a bliss, you could call it a bliss that is a kind of impersonal bliss. That's why it's the peace that passeth understanding, because it's not a peace for someone. It's not love is also a word that's been used many times to speak of this. But it's a love that is somehow a kind of unconditional love, a love that is a radical love, that is not an individual or personal love. And we can say that because what we're trying to speak about, thisness, this nothing, this no thing, it needs nothing. It lacks for nothing. It is, you could say, unconditionally complete. And so perhaps that's where the wonder comes from. Perhaps that's where the sense of bliss or impersonal love comes from. But it's certainly true to say that there is some sense of joy that is a quiet joy. It is an ordinary joy, because what we're really speaking of is the most ordinary thing. That's another thing I feel is important to emphasize, that this that sounds so vast, this unconditional, needless, causeless, timeless, spaceless, isness, that seems to us as individuals so vast. The important thing to understand is it is the most intimate thing imaginable, because it is literally here now. It is everything. You and I speaking on this Zoom is it. And so what can be felt, I think, is this kind of quiet, ordinary wonder and awe at what is everything already. And yes, I think you're right that there can be a kind of desire to communicate that and to share that. Yeah. Now I feel like I just wound into silence there.
Well,
but yes, it's there. It is the nature of everything. This wonder, this quiet wonder.
It's tough to know. It's very tough to know where to go on any avenue that would sort of spoil it. Or I am intrigued on the notion of freedom, because we spoke about the bliss. You write in your book about the feeling of freedom, and you relay this looking at a dog. It was a very intriguing little section.
Oh yes,
yeah,
yes. Did you want me to read that a little bit?
I think so. It was a fascinating section that well, it was very funny as well.
Okay, I'll read this. It's very interesting, by the way, James, that you focused on this passage, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But let me imagine you walk to the window and look out. Beyond is a park. In the wide expanse of green, you see a white dog running. Naturally, you do not feel yourself to be that dog. You do not try to own the personal experience of the dog as it runs through the park, chasing after a butterfly. You see it as part of the scene, as one with the view, a streak of life moving amongst life. Its story is not your story. It is simply just unfolding as the day unfolds, there in the window. What if the sense of yourself became like this? So that's the passage. And it's interesting that you point that out, because that particular passage, when I wrote it, I was surprised at myself. I didn't know where it came from. And it was perhaps the only passage in the book where I questioned. I think what I questioned was I use a very specific image this is just a mental image. I have no recollection of a white dog running through the park. It was an image that just seemed to come kind of unbidden to me. And so I wondered about it. I was like, why is this? Why have I written this? And it was the only passage that Charles, my editor, pointed out. He was like, this is very interesting. Maybe you should say more about it. And then he immediately kind of changed his mind. He was like, no, I think it stands. Like, just keep it as it is. And so there's something about this passage that maybe it appeals to the writer, because it uses this concrete yet kind of imaginal figure of the dog. I mean, there's a few things going on there. I think what I was really trying to point towards is again, it's this sort of non-doership. It's the idea that there's a possibility that life can be seen as unfolding for nobody, let's say, with nobody at the center of it, no feeling of something that claims that life. So it struck me that when we look out of the window and we see, the world outside, we don't project into that world and claim it. And there is something perhaps analogous that can happen when the sense of being a separate person kind of dissolves or fades away. That there is there is almost a seeing oneself in the third person that can happen. I mean, interestingly, I've been lucky enough to speak to a couple of people who have had very similar experiences to mine, and people who have had much more lasting experiences, in fact. And they also felt at times this third personing almost of existence. And it's an interesting exercise in a way to see yourself this way. And it points towards, some very classic moves, if you like, that we find in the non-dual traditions. There's a kind of exercise of trying to connect to the witness consciousness, as it's often called. So the idea that there is experience and then there is that which witnesses experience. And that very often we conflate the two. We identify with the experience when there is something always there, something unchangeable, something that's not affected by the content of experience, that is witnessing that experience. And often that, let's say, focusing on that is used as a doorway, if you like, into this kind of understanding. So maybe there's some echo of that in this passage. I think there's something also interesting that I talk about, that I use this dog. There's a couple of animals that pop up in the book, and I think maybe that what's behind that is, I have a very strong feeling. I mean, of course, there's no way to prove this, but I have a strong conviction that animals don't have a sense of separation, that animals are just life. They don't see themselves, they don't claim life. They don't see, oh, this is my life, I got to figure it out. A dog doesn't do that. A dog is simply a kind of expression, if you like, of thisness.
Dogs definitely, but I feel that cats, I feel that cats don't, but I feel that they've been through it, and that they now know, because they have a certain arrogance about them, that they know they can just get away with.
I love that.
Lounging around and sleeping all day, So I feel that they've gone through it, and now they know, so they're sort of playing the hand they've been dealt.
They're slyer about it.
Yeah, very cunning.
Maybe.
Dogs aren't cunning, are they?
Dogs are not in any way cunning. I remember I went with my family to this place, which was like a goat farm. And one of the things that they allowed you to do was just hang out with the baby goats. And it was very striking to me that I came out of that hour or whatever it was with these baby goats completely relaxed. It was like my entire nervous system just chilled out, because I had spent this time with these animals that felt like they were just expressing life. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what the natural world can do for us, actually. I think that's one of the reasons why when we take a walk in some natural, beautiful place, or when we spend time with animals, maybe not cats, but when we spend time with animals, this can happen to us. There can be a sort of in training or something. There can be a kind of, maybe a relaxation of that default tension that I mentioned before around animals, So I think that's there. That's probably echoing in that passage.
Yeah. I'm really glad you mentioned the default tension, because I think spiritual seeking is synonymous with getting rid of a stomachache that arises probably our first day of school, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think that default tension, I think it arises probably. I don't think it's there when we're infants, when we're babies. My instinct is it comes online a little later. When you see a child develop, there is a moment where there seems to be this sense of claiming and of separation that kind of almost comes online, 2 or 3 or something. That's my instinct about that. But yes, look, I mean, I think the paradox again is that it is literally the dynamic, if you like. It's the engine of the sense of separation. You could say the ego, to want to make things better, to get more experience and better experience. That's what it does. And of course, that desire, because of the nature of desire, can never be fulfilled. That you get the thing, if you're lucky, you get the thing that makes things feel better. And then very quickly you realize, well, that feeling hasn't lasted. There's something else. If I get this other thing, then I'll be better.
I do want to focus on that because I'm really glad you said it right at the start, because this is, and it's probably because, being transparent, it's a position I've found myself in probably for the last maybe even 3 or 4 years. And there's a distinct difference between, and maybe because, if I do say so myself, I never really wanted too much, but I did want some things. So you mentioned being 30 and achieving success. And I think there's probably what's more dangerous than getting to 70 or 80 and passing away and having these deep supposed regrets of not achieving things is being 30 and achieving everything, or achieving at least achieving enough to then see and have that deep sense of this is absolutely not going to do anything. This has zero purchase on the feeling or the intuition or whatever it is that I'm searching for. And I'm happy you said that, because I want to ask, what was the feeling? If you can think back, what was the feeling for you once you came to that realization? Because for me, it's a strange neutrality. It's an openness. It's not like melancholy or anything like that. It's just a very peculiar, oh, I'm still here.
Well, for me, it was, and I think this also can happen. I think what it started to open up was a kind of nihilism, actually. Was a kind of, oh my God, this whole thing is fake. This thing that I've been sold, that if I do these things, if I achieve these things, it will give me happiness. It will give me a sense of completion. I mean, I feel like it's peace. Really what we want is peace. We want a sense of, oh, I can stop now. But when that clearly was not the case, I think where I went to was this nihilistic place of like, that was all bullshit. And actually, this whole thing is a kind of mirage. And what we're left with is meaninglessness, I suppose. And I felt that growing in me, but I also felt I also knew somewhere that wasn't the whole story. That actually that was going to lead me down a road which is actually no less enslaved to some story of, it was just the sort of negative, if you like, the negative space of the same story.
Yeah.
That's what I think nihilism is, in a way. Nihilism is taking actually what is this shining, joyful, as we've said, truth, and compressing it into a concept.
Yeah.
Then you feel that you need to apply to life and your attitude towards life. And so there was something in me that didn't want to go down that route, or could feel that wasn't the way either. But I think it's what actually happens to a lot of people who achieve success, especially early. It becomes you become adrift into that. And I think there's 2 ways you can go, really, when confronted with the very clear truth that no external achievement will ever give you what you want from it. And you either go into this kind of place of meaninglessness or nihilism. You know, in a sense, meaninglessness is an interesting one, because in a sense, what we're speaking about is meaninglessness, but it's meaninglessness for no one.
Yeah.
And I think you can go into a very compressed place where in a way, the ego or the sense of separation has become, you're on the other side of the spectrum, that has become the horizon line, if you like. And I think it was, in some ways, it was the recognition that this was maybe a that story was a possibility for me that made me want to avoid it, that made me want to go somewhere else or or made me understand that you have to look somewhere else. So that's what I think happened at that time in my life. I mean, there was a kind of depression too, which is it's almost inevitable that when confronted with the impossibility of the things you've been working for, whatever period of time, the impossibility of those things ever giving you what you want from them, of course, there can be a kind of a depression there too. But that's what it was for me. I mean, your neutrality is very interesting. It may be that you also have an inclination that it's not the full story, Well,
I think maybe I jumped a couple of steps ahead. I certainly went through the nihilism, pessimism era, and then I think you, as you rightly said, you have the realization that is its own form of grasping, one that I think is actually doubly dangerous because it is the ego telling itself. The ego has sort of developed or said that, oh, look at all that falseness, and so it's what they call cynical reason or cynical logic. The ego then really does bolster itself even more because it's telling itself it's found the truth and has the one up. And I think that is the reason people stay cynical often for their entire lives, is because it always seems like it's the one up, but really it's just the self same ego mechanisms, just you're finding a different flavor. But it's strange, right? Because you mentioned the sort of what we're talking about is duality with regard to the ego, and of course, if you've had all this success, which isn't up, as per much Advaita teaching, they'll tell you, look, if you're in duality, you have to deal with dualisms as well. So if you've gone up, you have to deal with the down. But it's interesting that we do seem to be able to stay down a lot longer. But I guess, but in a weird way, that becomes its own up, I think, right? It's very self-congratulatory.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's another way perhaps to look at that, which is that it may be that these moments of upness, let's say, of happiness, it may be that actually what's happening there is not that we are experiencing happiness. It's that for a brief period of time, that mechanism of wanting, let's say our sense of separation, relaxes. That when we get the thing that we feel like we need, what can happen is that sense of separation, it's like the clouds can clear and the sky becomes obvious again. Mm-hmm. And then over time, because that mechanism, that dynamic is still there, that is obscured again. That natural, it may be that we get a glimpse of this natural, ordinary rest and joyfulness that we've been talking about, and that then it's covered over again. Then what comes back is the sense that we are separate and we need to find something else to get that. Yeah. But what we're not seeing is that which we're getting a glimpse of is already the case, is already what's here always. So I think that there's that way of seeing that kind of that cycle, if you like. And in which case, our periods of darkness, our periods of downness are the periods in which the truth, if you like, or the natural condition of things is most obscured, seemingly, to us.
Yeah. Agreed.
Of course, again, we brought back to the unspeakable, which is that even those moments of darkness are already freedom expressing itself as that. To go back to freedom, the freedom that we're speaking of here is even our imprisonment is freedom appearing as imprisonment. Yeah, that's the radical freedom. Of course, we can speak of a kind of personal freedom, but and we can have a whole discussion of what constitutes the conditions for personal freedom. But really, what we're talking about, what I'm trying to point towards, I think, and what we're trying to put together point towards, is a kind of freedom that is this radical, unconditional, impersonal freedom that is the nature of everything.
Well, I mean, to hazard a metaphor for that, I love this thing by R.D. Laing, because we were talking about depression there and being in the down state. R.D. Laing has this thing about depression and I love this, but I'll try flip it into Advaita as well. Depression is being in the deepest, darkest dungeon, and you're at the cell right at the end. But his point was, being this radical psychologist, was that the door is unlocked, the door is open. Now, that would keep it in the phenomenal world. So maybe what we could say for the Advaita is that when you're in a depression, in the sense that we're trying to understand it here, is that cell itself is the opening of the door.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make. Well, look, if we really try to stay with this truth, we could say absolutely everything is a doorway into this. Everything. Depression, not depression, this cup on my desk, everything is a doorway into thisness. So yes, the door in a sense is always open. How to walk through it is the question.
Well, who is
walking through it?
Who is walking through it? And also there's the problem of to walk is a direction and is time, which doesn't play a role.
Yeah.
The door is now, there it's gone.
Yes. I mean, and so, but here's what I would say. Isn't it somehow a relief to be speaking of something that has no use whatsoever? Isn't it could it be somehow seen that to even try to speak of something that cannot be instrumentalized in any way is, in a way, the revelation? One of the things I get to in the book, and we're back into the paradox here, speaking of this, we're back into the play, if you like, or the dance of form and formlessness. But it is something that's arisen for me of, if this sense of separation were to fall away, were to dissolve, seemingly, of course, nothing is dissolving because that sense of separation never really was there. But let's say if this sense of separation seemed to go away for all of us tomorrow, what might change? What might change in this world of form? And it seems to me that so much of what causes suffering, let's say, on a global scale, is caused by the mechanism of the ego instrumentalizing things, wanting to dominate another, wanting to make things better for itself. And if that were to go away, then where would that come from? Now, I can't answer that question because it also feels completely unpredictable. It feels that anything can arise, really, in this boundless.
Well, I'd hazard a guess and say nothing would change.
Well, okay, that is also possible. That is also possible, but in a way, I would say this: if this were the case, that everyone's sense of separation fell away, yes, perhaps nothing would change, but absolutely everything would be different.
Agreed. I mean, I love what Ramesh Balsekar says about this, because people obviously would come at him with this sort of finger wagging. Well, this is just fatalism. So if everyone knows this, why is anyone going to get out of bed tomorrow, right? Yeah. If everyone knows this, and he says, "All right, well, try it. try not getting out of bed." And his point is, what is, and will keep being what is. And so, exactly. as your book makes clear, as best it can, in speaking about the unspeakable, is that it still happens, but you're the witness.
Yes, and not even the witness, ultimately. And yes, what we're, in a way, to really think that there is no prescription here.
Yeah.
it's very difficult to think that. We're not really speaking of something that's conceptualizable, I think, because in a way, what we're saying doesn't touch anything.
Mm.
It doesn't offer a prescription for anything. And we can have a separate discussion in which we can offer a million prescriptions. But in this discussion, what we're trying to point towards, I think, is that yes, nothing this doesn't touch suffering. Suffering will happen, and the fight to end suffering will happen.
Yeah.
All this is saying is those are equally boundlessness, equally emptiness.
Well,
a period of that.
Yeah, we were speaking about koans earlier, and I think when we talk of prescription, I mean, probably the most famous Advaita Vedanta prescription is Ramana Maharshi, who says, ask yourself, who am I? And that in itself is a paradox, because as soon as you do that, it dissipates, because it's a question that has no answer, or that gestures towards nothing. And so there's your prescription. Or what's the other famous on having no head, right? You point to yourself and you say, who is that? Or like, what am I pointing to?
Mm-hmm.
Or who am I pointing to? So all of any prescription is immediately not a prescription, because it dissipates in its paradox.
Yes, absolutely. What more can I say?
So
Not much.
How do we end? Laughter?
With laughter. Well, look, here's that's a beautiful image. Here's what I want to share. This is what I want to share, because it's been I quite recently discovered this, but my friend who is a Zen practitioner introduced me to, I don't know if you're familiar with the ox herding woodcuts, the Zen ox herding woodcut.
I'm not. No.
So we could do an entire podcast, and maybe you should, on the Zen ox herding woodcut. What they are is they're a set of 10 woodcuts, 10 images that in the Zen tradition are supposed to show the, let's say, the path to enlightenment, or the path to this understanding. And they take as their central image, a boy starting off as a young boy, trying to herd an ox, trying to sort of wrestle with an ox. And this ox, I mean, of course, I'm sure there are many nuances and differences in sort of minor interpretational differences, but broadly, what the ox represents is what we're trying to speak about, right? The true nature of things. And this boy at the beginning is rather mistakenly trying to wrestle with this and tame this ox. So when I heard about these woodcuts, my arrogant brain, who thinks it knows everything, was like, oh, well, I know what number 10 would be. Number 10 must be some image of oneness, of emptiness. It would be like the Zen circle, the kind of brush stroke circle. It would be something like that.
Yeah.
And when I saw these woodcuts, I'm still in the resonation of how stunned I have been by these things, because what I saw was this image is there, but it's number 8. It's number 8.
Yeah.
So there are 2 steps after this understanding, this apprehension, let's say, of allness, of emptiness. And so what's 9 and 10? Well, 9 is, I think, the caption. Each one has a kind of caption and sometimes a poem attached. But number 9 is return to the source. So what it really is it is an image of the natural world. Sometimes it's the kind of garden outside of the man's house, but it's a kind of natural world. And what it really shows is, that the ox has gone, the boy has gone. It's just nature, but it's nature in the context of number 8. So it's the world seen as emptiness, really. Mm-hmm. Right? And what's number 10? So what's number 10? Number 10 is a rotund old man with a beard, strolling through the marketplace, barefoot, laughing. Yeah. That's number 10.
That's fantastic.
It's the fat old man laughing in the marketplace. That's where we end up, I think. I mean, to me, that image resonates with me and stays with me every day. And maybe that's where we could end.
I mean, it's a fat old man laughing.
Fat old man laughing, barefoot in the marketplace, and he's in the world. He's not on a mountain. He's walking through this place of society and commerce and transaction and the world of form. But he's barefoot and he's laughing.
There we go.
Now,
Well, I will put links for Notes on Nothing, The Joy of Being Nobody by Anonymous, yourself, in the description below by As Is Press. Once again, a big thank you to them. And it is, I should say, it is a beautiful little book. Physically, it's a lovely little thing. So those links will be in the description below. And there we go. Thank you very much for this great
thank you, Jay.
discussion.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much.